I see.
See, the RPs are sitting up front.
They are. That's pretty typical.
I think I may have enough of these. If we're running a little short, we can share the table and we can get some copies if you want copies of this. Something for you to follow along with. My name's Steve Ketcham. Right now, I work here in town at the Westinghouse facility just up the road off the River Terminal Road. I've been with them, I guess, about 9 months now. I started last May. Prior to that, I did work at INPO for 14 years. And prior to that, I worked at the Salem and Poe Creek facilities in New Jersey, which are 2 PWRs and a single BWR, for about 15 years. And did a few things for a few years before that, and spent 8 years in the Navy before getting into the commercial aspect of it. I actually left the Navy in July of 1979, which was about 2 months after the 3 Mile Island accident, and just about 3 or 4 months before INPO, that we're going to talk about tonight, came to be. So I've seen both sides of the industry and how it's progressed over the last 35 years or so as a result of the organization we're going to talk about, which is INPO. Anybody here familiar with INPO or know what INPO is? Can you describe what is INPO?
Well, what I know, I could be completely wrong, but I know that the INPO comes in and is kind of like an inspection, kind of like the NRC, but a little stricter. And if the INPO says that it's good, then the NRC says that that's really good, that it's above their standards. That's the limit of what I...
Okay. Go ahead.
A method of sharing information from one to another.
That's one of the cornerstones, they call them. One of the major things that INPO was created for was to share information throughout the nuclear industry. Evaluations is another of the second of the 4 major cornerstones that INPO has. They're not regulatory. We don't inspect. I say we, I'm no longer work with them. They do not inspect, they evaluate performance. They'll go in and observe what the people are doing, how they're doing it, what are the procedures. They'll interview folks about what they're doing and their knowledge and understanding of what the industry standards are, what the station standards are, and reviewing how they've been performing over the last period of time, usually on a 2-year basis. And then based on that, they'll assess the plant against a series of standards, which I'll mention later, and then provide the company's chief executive officer a report on what they saw, what they were doing well, and also where they could improve. So it is not a regulatory organization. It is a, I'll get into just a minute what it really is. It's a nonprofit organization that is completely financed and managed by the nuclear utilities in this country. So that's 2 of the 4. There are actually 4 milestones, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go. So we kind of hit on what in the beginning. 3 Mile Island happened on March 29th, 1979. Everybody here familiar with 3 Mile Island, I'm assuming. It's one of the milestones, if you will, not a good one, but a bad one in the domestic nuclear, commercial nuclear industry here. But immediately following, within weeks of that accident, President Carter commissioned a special committee commonly referred to as the Kennedy Commission. And in that report, the Kennedy report that they presented to President Carter, they made a number of recommendations. One of them was that the nuclear power industry should establish a program that specifies appropriate safety standards, including those for management, QA, quality assurance, operating procedures and practices, and that conducts independent evaluations. Prior prior to 1979, each nuclear facility in this country was privately owned, and they were doing their own thing. The commercial nuclear industry in this country really began in the late 50s. 1960, everybody was ordering nuclear plants, and there was tons of construction on nuclear facilities going on across this country. But there was no uniform set of standards or expectations for what they were, how to operate them, all of those types of things. Everybody did their own. I mentioned in Salem and Oak Creek. The Salem units were constructed in the first one in the early 70s, and then the second one completed actually a little bit later, but late 70s. But all of the operators, the initial crews of the control room operators, nuclear operators, came out of our fossil plants. All of our maintenance people came out of the fossil plants in North Jersey. We brought them down and said, here, now you got to run. They ran the nuclear facility just like they ran the fossil plants, other than the fact that we didn't burn coal. We used nuclear fuel as the fuel source. But to them, running a plant was running a plant. We had no quality standards and any of that sort of stuff. The nuclear regulations, I won't say relaxed, but they were pretty vague at that particular point in time. They met all those standards, but certainly didn't meet any high levels of performance standards. So the Kennedy Commission made a recommendation. The nuclear industry, and this is important, should establish a program. And there must be a systematic gathering, review, and analysis of operating experience at all nuclear plants, coupled with an industry-wide international communications network to facilitate speedy flow of this information. I hope you all know the 3 Mile Island accident was avoidable. If you're familiar with that accident, there was a similar event at a plant not too far in the past from that. Exactly the same set of circumstances. However, the operators at that plant properly diagnosed what was going on and took the appropriate actions. They didn't share that information with anybody in the industry. There was no requirement to do that. Had the folks at 3 Mile Island known what had happened at that other plant, PMI probably would not have happened. But because they were unaware of that information, they misdiagnosed the indications, took the inappropriate actions, and we all know what happened as a result of that. And that's what the second part was. We had no way of sharing information, lessons learned throughout the industry. Again, we were individual, privately owned companies looking to make a buck. And when you get companies, they can be side by side trying to make a buck. We keep that information to ourselves, right? We're not going to share that information. We don't want to give away the competitive edge. So those were the two big things. March 29th, 3 Mile Island occurred. INPO, in response to the Kennedy Commission, created the Institute of Nuclear Power Operations, which is INPO. They incorporated in October and actually began in December. So within about 8 months, INPO came to be as a corporation. Now, it is a nonprofit. You said it was incorporated as a nonprofit corporation. It is a nonprofit corporation. The industry formed it. It's staffed by industry people. The utilities pay a fee based on their capacity to INPO. They pay 100% of INPO's annual budget through those fees. INPO's annual budget today is probably about $100 million. That year it was about $30 million. But the nuclear industry utilities pay for that 100%. Now, in the beginning, when they formed, they actually hired a retired Navy admiral, nuclear, who grew up with Admiral Rickover and created the nuclear Navy, who understood what high standards were, what good looked like in operating nuclear facilities, so they hired him to come in. But most of the staff were loanees from the industry. The chief executive officers of all those companies, the initial group that formed INPO, gave some of their best engineers, managers, operators, and those folks to go down to Atlanta to work at INPO, to begin developing these procedures and these standards, and to begin putting together this process of doing evaluations. Today, INPO has about 380 or so employees. Other than the administrative staff, who are all full-time, it has 2/3 of their evaluation folks are full-time employees, all experienced nuclear professionals. Folks who have been in this industry a minimum of 10 years working there, and the other 1/3 are what they call loaned employees. They fill the gaps, but these are folks who have current plant experience, because they're coming right out of the plants and going to work. They're there for periods between 18 and 24 months. And at the end of that time, they go back to their parent utility. And part of that is they learn what the standards that INPO has developed look like and how to evaluate those so they can bring that experience back to their own plant. But it also makes room for new folks. I mean, I was there 14 years, which meant I was out of an operating plant, hands-on for 14 years. And the industry had changed over those 14 years. But having those folks come out and say, this is what we really do, this is what happens in the plants today, not only brings that to the teams that are out there, but it adds credibility to the teams that are to the plant that they're there, because they're their peers. If I'm a maintenance evaluator on loan and I'm going out evaluating maintenance and I'm interacting with the maintenance manager at that plant, we're peers. When I leave here, I'm going back to the plant and I'm just like you. So it brings a lot of credibility to the teams having those loan employees. So INPO's mission was created in 1979 and has not changed since that day. Basically says INPO's mission is to promote the highest levels of safety and reliability, meaning excellence, in the operation of nuclear electric generating plants, which is what you're saying. INPO's standards are well above the NRC standards, if you will. The NRC standards are what you must meet in order to comply with the regulations. INPO standards are much higher than that. And the fact is that the NRC has recognized what INPO does. And if plants are being assessed in their performance in those ranges well above minimum compliance, the NRC has a high confidence that that plant is safe. They still have a regulatory requirement. They have resident inspectors on site. They still have to write reports and all of that sort of stuff. But for plants that are assessed good or excellent performance by INPO, they will receive what you might say is a lower level of oversight by the NRC. Plants that are struggling or get assessed lower in their performance, those are the ones the NRC wants to make sure are moving up. It's also the ones INPO puts most of their time and effort into helping, because we, as they say, we're all in this together. We are all in this together. So, but excellence is determined by evaluating performance to establish standards, and those standards are documented. They're called performance objectives and criteria. And as I mentioned, observing station performance. So there are established standards in every area of operation of a nuclear facility. And not only is there an objective of what that is, there's a listing, a number of criteria of what would that look like. In operations, for example, what does good operations look like? And they bulletize those things. And all of these standards, all of the INPO documents have been created and approved by by working groups of industry, workers and executives, along with INPO folks, and they approve those. So although it's got an INPO name, you have to recognize INPO is the industry. It's not an independent organization, although it is independent. But when we say INPO, we're talking industry. The industry manages it. The board of directors of INPO are all chief executive officers of the nuclear utilities. They also have advisory committees on there who have no affiliation with the nuclear to help ensure that we don't become so siloed in our world that we don't look outside the box. But INPO, everything that's created and documented as standards and all the documentation that's out there has been created and approved by the industry. So they don't do it in a vacuum. And we already talked a little bit about four cornerstones. First one is evaluation. We'll talk about it. The second one is training and accreditation. In the Kennedy report, one of the major causes, contributing causes to that accident was the operators really didn't know what they were doing. Didn't really understand the indications. We didn't have simulators.
What event?
I'm sorry?
What event are you describing?
3 Mile Island. So a lack of adequate training, if you will, was a contributing cause to that. And one of the major milestones was training and accreditation. I'll talk a little bit about accreditation. But developing performance-based training programs. Back then, there was, on the TWR side, there was one simulator in the country. It was in Zion. And it might have been two. There was one in Pittsburgh through Westinghouse. But every operator went through that generic simulator. Well, right after 3 Mile Island, the requirement was every plant would have a plant-specific simulator. So every plant now has a plant-specific simulator to their plant where they can train and operate and run drills and do all that sort of stuff. And then we have events analysis and information exchange, which we've already hit. And then the last one is assistance. And I'm going to go over all of these in a little bit more detail. I already kind of hit this as, well, who's part of INPO? Participation in INPO is voluntary. It is not a requirement. But there is not a single domestic utility who is not a member of INPO, nor is there a single domestic utility that would ever consider leaving. Two major reasons. One, if you're not part of INPO, then the NRC bears the burden of observing and assessing performance. So they're going to be more intrusive in your operations, and that's something most of us wouldn't want. So that's one reason. The other is, if you're not in INPO, you do not have access to all this information sharing. This is members only. So there's a big advantage. It's a large investment, these utilities. They write that check every year to support INPO. It's a major investment, but it's money well spent. All U.S. nuclear utilities are members of INPO. And in 1986, Chernobyl occurred. Prior to 1986, INPO, and INPO still is, was domestic within the U.S. We focused here, within our own boundary. When Chernobyl happened, we recognized that, you know what, we have 100 or so nuclear plants, operating plants in this country. There's another 300 plus operating in the world. Why don't they share? So WANO, or the World Association of Nuclear Operators, was formed in following the Chernobyl accident in 1986. And INPO does support that, but some WANO members, the WANO is international, are also members of INPO. They pay dues in both clubs. They pay dues to be a member of WANO, which is an international organization, but they'll also pay dues to be a member of INPO because of the additional information, the additional support, and the fact that INPO's standards, expectations, and evaluations of performance are higher than WANO. We don't have, and WANO doesn't have the authority, if you will, to go to all these other countries around the world and say, well, we don't like the way you're doing something. They go out, they assess, they'll make recommendations for improvement. And if things are really bad, they might get more involved in terms of making sure that things get improved. But WANO and INPO are not on equal playing ground. So those that want that higher level of assessment, if you will, join INPO as well. So there are many operating organizations in other countries, plus our NSSS, GE, Westinghouse, and those folks are all members. Many AE engineer and architect engineering firms are members of those. Construction firms are members, and we call them suppliers, and there's a separate group of those. It's called a supplier participant program at INPO. They have limited, they don't have access to everything because they're not operating plans, but they have access to operating experience, and they do participate in advisory committees and those types of things. So it's opened up to them, that again, they pay for that going into it. So on the Portastones we talked about, do you have a question?
Was Japan a part, or are they a part of?
INPO? No. They're part of WANO, but not part of INPO.
Okay.
The international Canadian plants, all the Canadian plants are INPO members. Mexico, South Africa. And maybe one other, I think. But those are the ones that are INPO members. The difference is they get, in addition to getting what WANO calls what do they call it? Here we call it evaluations. I think there's peer reviews. On the WANO side, they're called peer reviews when they bring in a team to do an evaluation. Here they're called evaluations, and they, in addition to getting their WANO peer reviews, which aren't on the same frequency, they request that INPO does an evaluation just like they do in domestic. So they're holding themselves to the same standards that we hold all of the domestic plants to. They get the same reviews, they get the same assessment as we do.
But we don't share information with it. Okay.
Yes. WANO has their own for WANO members, but a lot of those overlap, and we share, but we all share that information. Of the four cornerstones, evaluations, training, assessments, assistance, and operating experience, this is the one that gets the most attention. This is the one that gets the most visibility, and this is the one that gets the plant's attention. This is the one, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, this is the one the plants fear the most. There's a lot riding on this evaluation. I'll talk a little bit about that. These are performance-based plant evaluation, and it had, the first one I think was done in January, February of 1980, shortly after they formed, so they've been doing this for a long time. And the guidance has changed and the standards have changed over the years, but it's always been performance-based evaluation. An evaluation team for a domestic review consists of somewhere between 20 and 25 people. I don't know how many we have in here, about 20. So a team consists of individuals from every functional area of the plant: maintenance, RT, chemistry, operations, training, engineering, management, I mean, the whole work, outage planning, the whole bit. Some full-time employees, and they're really the ones that are there to make sure that we're following the process and sticking to the standards. About half of that team is peer reviewers, meaning folks from different utilities come in and spend 2 weeks, really 3 weeks, almost 3 weeks, with the team, and they go out and assess, so it's a peer-to-peer review. They have what is called host peers, which means 2 individuals from the plant that's going to be evaluated come and become part of that team. So they step over the line, if you will, and then become evaluators. So they're actually out evaluating their plant to the same standards. They're there to help the team because they understand the culture at the plant. They're also there to help us make sure that we get what we need quickly, because they don't have a lot of time in there. So if they're looking for a piece of information, they'll say, you need to go talk to Bob, here's his phone number, or those types of things. So they're there to evaluate, but they're also there to hold us accountable, hold the team accountable to the process and standards as well. There's also what's called a industry advisor. This would be a site vice president or somebody at his level from another utility who comes out, who works with the team, particularly if there are major issues. So he's kind of can become that liaison between the team and the team manager and the site vice president if we're having a little discussion that they're just not quite getting. Kind of that common sense thing is VP to VP talking, says, you guys got to listen. You're not hearing what they're telling you. You got to listen to what they're telling you instead of always arguing about those types of things. So these are very diverse teams of individuals that go out. They spend a week looking through 2 years worth of data. Every report, every assessment, every corrective action that's been put in your area. We have functional areas. My area was training and performance improvement. We have maintenance guys and all of those functional areas. We spend a week or more plowing through their entire corrective actions. That we know what's happened at the plant over the last 2 years. What's happened, what do they do about it, what are their major issues, those types of things. And then you go out for 2 weeks and you spend time out in the field watching work, interviewing folks, talking to all levels of management about in your particular area. And then by the end of that period, you come together and say, what are the things that they're really doing well? Because we want to share that with the rest of the industry. This is all there's experience sharing here as well. But more importantly, what areas can they improve upon? Remember, this is not against minimum standards, right? Compliance. This is against excellence. So what does excellence look like? It changes week to week, year to year. Excellence is based on the performance objectives and criteria and the best that they've seen so far. So it kind of varies in terms of in those particular areas and saying, you know what? You're not doing as well as another plant is doing in this area, and we think you can improve here. So they can be big issues, but they can be very minor issues as well. But that's the reason they're called areas for improvement. It's an area that you can improve upon.
So do they go back to check the improvement, or is that just at the next evaluation?
Depends, and I'll cover that. I will cover that. Anybody know why, when I said this gets the most attention, and this is the area of INPO that the plans, I use the word fear the most. Anybody know the outcome of these?
Well, if INPO doesn't give them a good evaluation, they bring in the NRC.
Well, they don't necessarily bring them in.
The trend, the performance trend from an INPO 1, which would be a star performer, to an INPO 4, which would be a poor, would be perceived poor performer. That trend, if it's declining, and somebody should get that INPO 4 grade, the owner of the station has to take heed quick to make those changes.
Right.
The NRC, the fact that they could even lose their operating license if it continues to degrade.
Yeah. They could, but we don't really, I don't know that we've ever been there in this country. But the fact is, we say assess, they give them a grade, a scale of 1 to 5. 1 is excellence. And again, it's subjective, but it's based on their performance. How are they doing performance-wise in all areas, as well as safety, those types of things. So that's what a 1 is, defined as excellent. 2 is good, I mean very good. There's not a big gap between excellence and a 2. There's a range in there, but 2 is you're doing a good job. 3 is we have a little bit of concern here in some areas. 4, nobody's ever been below 4. If you were assigned a 5 by INPO, they would ask you to shut down. The NRC may tell you to shut down, but a 5 is bad. We don't have any bad plants. We have plants that struggle in some areas, and it may just be in maintenance, it may be in one area of the plant that they struggle in that's driving that down, because if the rest of the plant is doing an outstanding job and the chemistry department's doing a lousy job and they can't keep chemistry in their systems up, the plant's not doing well, right? It's collective, it's a collaborative thing. But they do get a grade. Everybody wants a 1. You're the top of the pedestal today. 2 years from now, you might be a 3, because excellence varies, right? It changes, and if you don't keep your eye on the ball, you may slide down the other side of that slope. Yes, ma'am?
Will you give us an idea now or later how the plants in our area?
No. I cannot do that. That's private.
Oh, is it?
Yes.
Oh, so it's not public knowledge?
If there are 1, they'll publicize it.
Right.
Trust me. But that's the CEO's prerogative.
Okay.
It is not made public by INPO, it is private. Which is one of the reasons INPO remains the way it is we don't publish that information. We give the report to 1 person. 1 copy of the report goes to 1 person, and that's the CEO.
Well, and
If
I
he
guess that's
chooses-
not the purpose of it. The purpose is to, well, I don't want to say keep it in-house, but it's not like a restaurant rating. I mean,
That's right.
Yeah,
That's right.
The chance to fix it before you're fined for it.
exactly.
Right. Now, the 1s are recognized at the annual CEO conference. When they all get in the room, they're recognized as having achieved that high level of performance. Those that are in the 3 and the 4 also get recognized in that CEO conference. And it's basically the other guy saying, what can we do to help you? Because if you don't do well, we don't do well. If they shut you down, they're going to shut me down, regardless of what my performance is. So there's part of this whole INPO thing, it is a self-policing organization. It's run by the industry, it's staffed by the industry supports it. It's an independent, it's not an incestuous organization, but there is a lot of peer pressure between organizations, particularly at the executive level. And that's what has made INPO a success over the last 30 years. After the BP oil incident in the Gulf last, was it 2 years ago? Congress asked our CEO to come and explain INPO and why we shouldn't implement that for things like offshore oil, for the oil industry, or others as well. There's no reason why we shouldn't, other than the fact they don't want to be held to that level of accountability. But early on, in 1979, the leaders in this industry recognized that we have to hold each other to very high levels of accountability in here, or we will all suffer. Yeah.
There's no way for us to find out who's the top performing power plant in the nation.
Well, there's a way you can find out who's been assessed a 1.
I mean, a legal way for it.
Yeah. You can go to the INPO office in Atlanta, go to the 2nd floor, and all their pictures are on the wall. They celebrate those individuals. They're all on a plaque from 1980 to today. Every plant has been assessed a 1 at one point or another. You know, once you're a 1 doesn't mean you're always a 1. But you were a 1 once, and they're on that plaque. Yeah, you can look. But those are the only plants that you'll ever know what they were assessed at.
Is in fact that INPO building open to the public? Can we walk up to that library area and see those plaques?
It's not a guarded facility behind barbed wire. It's a private building. But legally, if you were to go in and say, hey, you know, somebody wants to take me on a tour, I'd like to see that. It's not held in, it's not like Fort Knox, but it is owned by the industry, so we do kind of limit the information. We talked about the teams, institute and utility, plant performance and standards of excellence based on experience, best practices. That's what they do. And as a review, going back to your question, plants that may have been identified with some performance issues in an area, it might be a maintenance, could be an RP, could be a chemistry, could be an ops, wherever it was, they may go back and do review visits to supplement the evaluation to see how they're doing. Every evaluation where there is a documented area for improvement, the station has to provide a response to that on what they plan on doing to correct that issue. Now, the next time they go back, 2 years from now, they're going to look at those areas and say, have they addressed them? And they'll assess their performance, and if the performance is improved, great. If the performance hasn't been improved, we try and figure out why not. You've had 2 years to fix it. Have you just ignored it? Is it bigger than you can handle? What's the issue? Because your performance hasn't gotten any better. And they may have been assessed a 3 in that area 2 years ago, but if their performance hasn't gotten better, and maybe even declined, this time they may be assessed a 4 in that area, because the trend is in the wrong direction. So they do review visits to go back to help them, to help assess whether or not they're maintaining the evaluations.
How do you determine who comes up for review or whatever
Yeah, every plant gets a review on a
on
routine.
annual
No,
basis?
it's not every 2 years, 18 to 24 months depending on their operating cycle. Some plants operate on a 2-year cycle, most plants operate about an 18-month cycle. But every domestic utility will get a review about once every 2 years.
You're talking about after the refueling outage?
No? No, it's not based on coming out of it, it's just, we try not to go when they're in the middle of something. Now, if an outage occurs 6 months before the review visit, they'll send a team out to evaluate performance during a refuel, because that's something you don't ever get to see. And that'll become part of that report. If they have a unplanned shutdown a month before the review visit, they'll send a couple of operators out there to watch operations, either shut down or start up the plant, because normally the plant's running at 100% power. You don't get to see those types of things unless they're doing something on the simulator. So they look for every opportunity so they can assess the entire organization. All right. Let me just go back. Are there any other questions on the evaluation? I say this gets the most attention because that assessment number carries a lot of weight. It carries a lot of weight within the industry from the executives on a peer-to-peer basis. It also carries weight with the NRC. If you're assessed a 1 or a 2, the NRC's confidence level is high and that you're doing relatively well. You know, they don't turn their back and walk away. They're always there, but they're not as I would say as concerned, if you will. If you're assessed a 3 or even worse, a 4 with poor declining performance, the NRC wants to make sure that you're still meeting regulatory compliance, so they're going to be taking a little harder look at that. And I will say, although it's not directly tied to it, if you haven't, if you've been accident-free for 5 or 10 years in your car and now you have an automobile accident, what's the probability your premium's going to go up? Could be 100% depending on your insurance. You may get a little leeway if you're Allstate, you get an accident, whatever that is. But they're going to be able, if you have 2 accidents in a year or an accident every year, your premium's probably going to go up. Well, every utility is insured by the nuclear insurance company. And if you're rated a 1, your premiums are probably going to go down because the risk is lower for them. If your assessment number is lower, your premiums are probably going to go up because the risk is high. And in the nuclear industry, we know, 3 Mile Island, Davis-Besse, look at some of the plants that are shut down now. The nuclear plants shut down, it's expensive. It's not a $150 paint job for Mako, it's a multi-million-dollar project. So the insurance company they're going to fluctuate. So if I get a bad assessment number, not only is the NRC and the industry not going to be happy with me, my insurance man isn't going to be happy with me either. So that's the reason it gets so much attention, if you will, at the plant. It's a big deal.
There's a budget, something that's valued by INPO, their operating costs.
Is what?
Their budget or their operating costs, is that something that's evaluated?
Yeah. We look to see more, are they investing in the plant? Are they investing capital to improve? Or are they just getting by with 30-year-old equipment, putting bubblegum baling wire on it to keep it running? Or are they actually investing in the plant to ensure that it remains safe? If they're not, and they're having problems, that might be one of the causes. If they're a small utility, as part of a bigger corporation, and the corporation doesn't allow them to invest, then we might go upstairs to the corporate office and have a little chat with those folks down there, because what you're doing is impacting their ability, and that happens. That happens. Yeah, absolutely. The second cornerstone is training. I hit on this. The committee report identified lack of sufficient training of the operators. So coming out of this was one, a development of performance-based training, not just what do we think they should know to operate a power plant or to maintain it, but what do they need to know. You do a job task analysis. You're going to learn how to drive a car. There are certain things you have to know in order to safely drive a car. Do you have to know how to change a tire to safely drive a car? No. It's nice. I got AAA, I can change a tire, but I won't change it. But there are certain things you need to know in order to safely drive a car. Those are the things we want to make sure we train the individuals to do and make sure they know how to do their job. That was not being done prior to 1979. I'll be honest, what we did prior to that, we took the Navy's program, which was task-based, and applied it to the nuclear industry, and we trained everybody in this industry the way we trained everybody in the Navy. Well, we don't run submarines or aircraft carriers on land, so it's different. The equipment's different, systems are different, all that sort of thing. Culture is different. We didn't have that prior to 1979. We have that today. I won't say for every position at the plant, but those key positions at the plant of all those functional areas. And accreditation. Everybody familiar with what accreditation is? We know this university, this college gets accredited. Matter of fact, this program is going to be accredited this fall. It's important for you and for the college. Well, these programs are also accredited just like that. They have, just like the evaluation teams go out, they have what are called accreditation teams. These are people whose background is in training and understand that there's a whole slew of standards on training and what training should be. How do you do operator training? How do you do RP training? And all those functional areas. They go out and they evaluate the process. Are they following, have they developed good training programs? And then we observe them teaching. Are they teaching these folks properly? And are they using all the right tools and skill sets and all those types of things? There's also a report generated by the accreditation team. However, instead of sending that report to the CEO, he'll get a copy of it, but they send that report to an accrediting board. It's a 5-person board, and they meet about 10 times a year. And when the teams have done reviewing and assessing the training programs that they're looking at, they write a report about how they're doing, what's good, what needs to be improved in general, but it's kind of a broad overview of the training process. And it goes to this accrediting board. They read that report, and then on one bright sunny day, the team from the plant, site vice president, plant manager, depending on the programs, the maintenance manager, the RP manager, the training manager, all those guys who are responsible for that training program come to Atlanta. They sit in the boardroom before those 5 individuals, and they try and convince them why their training programs are meeting the standards. If the report's positive, they'll get probed a little bit. But if they've had issues, they're on the hot seat, because this accrediting board is putting their stamp of approval. This happens every 4 years instead of every 2 years. It's every 4 years. They're putting their stamp of approval saying these programs are accredited for the next 4-year period. It's kind of a leading thing. It's not, oh yeah, you did a good job. It's, we think you're going to continue to do a good job moving forward. And they're a tough bunch. 2 of those guys are industry executives. One of them is usually a professor, PhD type from a major university in training. One of them is a training manager or director of training at a major non-nuclear company, IBM, Motorola, those types of companies. And then the 5th is an individual who is recommended by the NRC. It's usually a retired NRC director or something along those lines. Now there's about 25 or 30 of these guys, but they pick teams, groups, boards of 5 to meet and go through this. Just like the assessment, they can renew accreditation for the next 4 years. they can put them on probation, which means, you know, some areas we're not convinced that you really got this. You know, there's an issue there you haven't resolved. They usually give them 6 months to go back and think about it or fix it, and then they have to come back before the board and show them, tell them what they've done. Those are the two that we always generally see. We don't have a lot of probations in the industry today, not like we used to, but those are the two. The third is they can pull it back. They can remove accreditation. Much like the evaluations, the NRC takes INPO's accreditation process into account for meeting the training regulations that are in Code of Federal Regulations. As long as they're meeting accreditation, just like the evaluations, the NRC standards, expectations are here, INPOs are higher. So as long as I'm meeting accreditation, the NRC is guaranteed I'm meeting those. If their accreditation is yanked away, taken away, withdrawn, in essence, what INPO is saying is you're not meeting the minimum standards. Now the NRC has to get involved, and they will come in and evaluate training. They don't like doing that. Plants definitely don't like that. So this took a while. The National Academy of Training at INPO wasn't actually formed until 1985. It took about 5 years for them to get that. The first accreditation occurred in about 1987. But these were for programs that had already been in place for a long time. But now every operating plant, their programs get accredited on a 4-year rotating cycle. So that has also helped to improve plant performance. So this is pretty much what I said. Now for new plants, I'm going to hit on this in the last couple of slides. The requirement is that training programs must be accredited by this board before you begin training. So for new plants like Vogel or BC Summer, new plants getting ready to be built, they are already developing their training programs. They are already getting ready to have accreditation review visits, usually about a year or so before they actually start putting people into the plants. They have operator training programs going on for Vogel right now, but they're not, before those operators can actually go in the plant and assume a watch, after they get the plant up and running, these programs have to be accredited. So there's about a 5-year lead time for training accreditation during this new construction period. So you have to hire your folks early, get your programs developed, go through this whole process before you can really start doing heavy-duty training. So training accreditation, like evaluation, is something that happens on a routine basis. Evaluations about every 2 years on the plant's accreditation, every 4 years for those programs. I put this last bullet down there just so that you're aware of this. Some of you might want to take advantage. Anybody aware of the Education Assistance Program through INPO? Oops. This is something the industry supports. I'm just going to give you some facts here very quick. This has been ongoing since 1980, so shortly after INPO was created, they instituted this educational assistance program for undergraduate and graduate studies. On an annual basis, they offer 125 scholarships at $2,500 each awarded to individuals, undergraduate, for studies in engineering, nuclear engineering, those types of things. At the graduate level, they give about 18 fellowships a year each of $25,000. That money is awarded to an institution that goes through an evaluation process, and then that institution will divvy up that 25 grand to individuals in graduate work going forward. Since 1980, the industry has provided over $26 million to support 5,700 students in this program. And for those who have gone through and graduated between 2006 and 2010, 83% of grad students and 70% of undergraduate accepted jobs in the nuclear industry. And that was really the purpose behind this, was to get folks interested in the nuclear industry and provide some financial support as they go along. So if anybody here in the future is looking for some of that and want to move on, just make you aware it is available. The third cornerstone we hit on was events analysis and information exchange. The information exchange came out of the Kennedy report, a way of sharing information, and you remember the wording in there was like an international computer system or something. They manage a very extensive computer database of operating experience out there. There are utilities, if something happens, they'll submit a report to INPO, they review it, they code it, and they'll stick it in this database. For more significant things that happen at the plant, they actually will do an event report, similar to maybe a common cause. They don't necessarily do a root cause analysis. They use a lot of, if the plant has had a significant event, the plant will do a detailed root cause analysis to figure that out. They'll use that, but what INPO is trying to do in this event is to broaden it to the rest, to say, here's some lessons learned. What can you learn from this that might help prevent you from experiencing the same situation that that plant is? And they issue reports. For those of you who might be familiar in the past, they were called SOERs, Significant Operating Event Reports. SERs, which are Significant Event Reports, SENs, which are Event Notifications. That changed last year. Now they're called INPO Event Reports, IER, Level 1, Level 2, Level 3, and Level 4. Level 1 is the highest. Significant Event. Davis-Besse, everybody familiar with Davis-Besse? Anybody not familiar with Davis-Besse? Davis-Besse plant in Ohio several years ago, due to some leakage on their control rod drive mechanisms. They have boric acid, they had leaks and the boric acid was leaking. And the boric acid in the water, when the water evaporates, you concentrated that boric, the acid there, and it ate a hole about that big through 6 inches of solid steel in the reactor head. They didn't know about it until they found it. Anybody familiar with what the inside of the reactor head has on it?
Stainless steel.
Got an 1/8 inch layer of stainless steel that's welded on there. That was the only thing that kept 2,200 pounds of highly contaminated liquid from bursting through that head when they finally found it. That was a significant event. That's a level 1 report. But things like that. And then they go down. Level 4 is just information. Hey, we're just going to share this with the industry. We're not doing any analysis. We don't have any recommendations. Level 1 reports have recommendations. They also have a requirement to respond to those recommendations in a set time frame. And those recommendations will be reviewed during the evaluation to make sure that they actually did what they said they were going to do. Because we do not need, nor do we want to ever see another Davis-Besse event. This entire industry came that close to shutting every pressurized water reactor down as a result of Davis-Besse. That close.
Well, benefit from this, of course, the information exchange would allow other sites to evaluate their heads for the same flaws, for the same faults, and many plants have since gone into head replacement and upgrade.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, the NRC obviously got involved with that as well, but you're exactly right. As these recommendations, every PWR had to go out and inspect their heads and verify that they didn't have it or document what they did have within a very tight time frame.
So it turned into a very good thing.
Yeah.
The industry has elevated itself up to a higher quality.
You're exactly, and that's why the information exchange is so valuable in this industry. We can get information out, particularly in the computer system today, we can get information out in seconds if something, once we're made aware of it, just to let you know what's going on, and then we'll follow that up with more detailed information later. It's not like it's sitting there and you might read it in the New York Times or the Gazette up in Pennsylvania in a few weeks. But and that's the events analysis. So we have people, they have analysts, that's all they do. They sit and look at all the data coming through, kind of the ticker tape every day, what's coming through the wire, what's being reported, are there any trends developing out there that we need to be aware of, any significant events. They'll work with the plants on their event analysis to help them figure out exactly what's going on so we understand it. All of that stuff takes place in this particular, and this is an organization within INPO. These are pretty specialized folks who understand this stuff and can write good reports and analyze that. And the operating experience database, very extensive. And the last one is assistance. And here's what I think is one of the major values of INPO. Accreditation goes out and they assess or evaluate performance and training. The evaluation team's going out and they're looking, their job is not to really look for the good stuff. Their job is to find stuff that can be improved. Well, identify the good stuff if it's really good so we can share with the other industry. If you want to know who's doing outage planning well, I can go to that database and they'll say these guys, at least within the last year, were assessed very high in that area, so I can call them and do some benchmarking. But their primary role is to identify things that can be improved so that we keep getting better. Assistance is the other side of that. The assistance is, a plant will call up and say, you know what, we had a couple of areas for improvement in maintenance last year on whatever. And we've looked at it and we've tried to do, we don't know what to do. We just don't know how to address this issue. Can you help? And that's where this group comes in. INPO will say absolutely. And what they'll do is they'll pull a team together, a small team of experts. They may be nuclear people, but they may be people in other industries. But these are people who have the expertise in that specific area that can go into the plant, look at what they're doing, talk to the people, and make some recommendations based on their experience of what they think might help them move forward. And this is one-on-one. This is not evaluative. They get no grade on this. They'll get a report on what they find. This is just like you going next door to help your neighbor. This is me and you. Let's fix this problem. And I think that's a valuable area to work in. Not only are we going out and identifying things you're not doing well, but if you need help fixing it, let us know. We'll get the resources in. We don't have all of them. You know, INPO's saying we don't have all the we have good people, but we don't have all the answers. But we'll go get you those answers if we have to. We'll go find the right people. And they've gone to the airline industry. They've gone to all sorts of industries to bring people in to help these guys because they come in with a different perspective. They don't have that nuclear mindset of this is the way it's always done, this is the way you have to do it. There's a number of ways of solving the problem. So they do help improve operations. And they run a lot of working, as it says, working meetings there, workshops, documentation, loan employees, they'll loan people out. I was on loan to a couple of utilities in an area. And all that does is bring a different perspective there. Ask different types of questions to help in a particular area. For a while, it's not just a one-week trip. You might be there for a year or 2 years to help them move, but all of that comes out of it. So those are the 4 cornerstones. Any questions on those? And I know we're running out of time, so I only got like 2 things left here. Yes, sir.
We just have one question. You may have already addressed it, but their initial evaluation visits, are they pre-scheduled or do they?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, they are pre-scheduled with the plant based on their operating cycle. We try not to interfere during outages, per se, those types of things. we also coordinate, we've been gone 9 months, man. It's just- They coordinate with the NRC because the NRC has pre-planned inspections when they're there. We don't want to be there when the NRC has a team there inspecting either. So we'll coordinate with the NRC. Our schedulers coordinate with the NRC schedulers, those types of things. But like I mentioned earlier, if there's an outage planned within 6 months of a planned evaluation, they will send people out there to observe during the outage. All of that information gets rolled into the report. If they have a unplanned shutdown, for example, they'll send an operator out that night to go out to the plant for a couple, 3 days to see what they're doing and then watch them do a startup, because that's an infrequent evolution. We don't get a chance to see the outages are one of the things they will always try and plan to send somebody out there with. But they are pre-planned, they're scheduled a year in advance, mostly for resources, but the plants know INPO's coming on this date, let's start sweeping, painting, cleaning up house, all that sort of stuff. There's a lot that goes into preparing for an INPO evaluation. Somebody else had a question.
Does the
Yeah.
NRC ever use INPO's evaluations when they go in to do their evaluations?
No.
It's totally separate.
NRC, NRC, upon request, can review a plant's evaluation report. They have to come to Atlanta, they sit in a room by themselves, they review the report, we take the report away, they leave. That's it.
So they do have the opportunity.
They have the opportunity to review it, but it's under very strict control. We don't send them a copy electronically or any of that sort of stuff. They gotta come to Atlanta and actually review it. These reports, one of the reasons INPO has been so successful over the years is that it is private. INPO does not share that information with anybody. People have tried using the Freedom of Information Act. It belongs to INPO and it belongs to the plant. If you want that information, go to the plant. If they want to share it with you, that's their prerogative. We do not have that prerogative. That's INPO's. You get one copy of the report, it goes to the CEO. If he chooses to share that with his plant staff, that's his prerogative. He always does. And INPO recommends to them that they share that report with their resident inspector, but they don't have to. The NRC doesn't, it's not an immediate, it's not an obligation that they review that report. And that's one of, like I said, one of the reasons INPO has been so successful is because all of that is, it's for the utilities benefit only. Only. Anything else on that? Yeah.
Who is responsible for checking up on the, like, nuclear navies?
Navy.
So INPO doesn't have anything to do with that?
Nuclear reactors, they have their own branch of people that go out and do that sort of stuff. So, new territory. The industry's changing. It changed in April, right? Fukushima happened, the industry changed again, just like it changed in 1979 with TMI, it changed again in 1986 with Chernobyl. And man, we thought we were climbing, we were on a straight and narrow, we were moving forward, we were going to do all this new construction, and then Fukushima happened, and everything basically came to a screeching halt. Right? Well, INPO is involved with that, but they're also involved with new construction. When TVA redid Browns Ferry Unit 1 that had been shut down for 30 years, we did what we call review visits, startup readiness reviews. They were looking at the construction, the training of their operators. Are you ready to start up? Well, that's part of their new job. They have a whole new department there on new plans that are looking at construction, lessons learned. A lot of new construction going on overseas, in France and China and a lot of other countries. We're learning from what they're doing. We're learning from their mistakes, but we're also learning from the good things that they've been able to do over there. Now, the culture's different. Construction culture is different. Doesn't mean that we'd be able to do everything the same way they're doing it here because we've got different construction codes and we've got regulations, but we're learning from that. But we'll talk about Fukushima. When Fukushima happened, there was a core group of people on call, actually in a room at INPO 24/7, and they were there to help the industry. You need a helicopter, You tell us, we'll find it. Don't you worry about it. Let us do that for you. You got better things to worry about. You need diesel generators, you tell us, we'll get it for you. So they were there as a coordinating center, but they were also there gathering all of this information, what was going on, what actually happened, all of that stuff. And they eventually, just a few months ago, issued a special report on the event. I read, there were things in there I didn't come out in the news. Good stuff. But that's where they were, and again, they constructed a special report. They're still doing that, they're still following what's happening over there. They had people over there, go over there to help any way they could, but they're still supporting Fukushima because it'll be 30 years before Fukushima is done. Anybody know how long it took them to actually get into the containment of TMI? After the accident? 10 years. It took them 10 years to be able to get in containment to actually assess the damage of the port. We had no idea the extent of the damage for 10 years. All we knew is it was bad, but it was contained. It'll be probably that long before they actually get in to assess Fukushima's core damage.
Was it the Japanese government for the utility, did they request that INPO
Oh, yeah.
come in and offer their assistance? Or they just
No, they took anything they could get. The Navy was there supporting, our Navy was there supporting them, the utilities have people over there. Westinghouse has people still over there today supporting whatever they need. Again, they're not in this country, but you can see what happened there affects everything we do over here. There are tons, just like after 3 Mile Island, a lot of plants had to stop construction, go back and reconstruct to higher standards with instrumentation, accident assessment, that type of stuff. Same thing's happening with Fukushima. They're coming out with recommendations. The NRC is saying, okay, go do it. And the industry is going, slow down, we'll get there, but it's not something we can do overnight, and it's going to cost billions of dollars to do this stuff. So let's prioritize what you want now, and we'll get the rest of it later. So it is changing the canvas, so to speak. Yes?
I have a question on the plants, the nuclear plants in the United States that are reaching 30 and 40 years in age. What has INPO in place for evaluating and updating these plants?
Nothing. Not their job.
It's not.
It is not their job. That's the NRC's job. Many of those plants have already put in for license extensions and have been approved, or they're under review, extending their license for 20 years to 60. The other thing is, many plants have already done what's called power upgrades. We're running the same number of nuclear plants today as we were in 1980, let's just say, thereabouts. But our generation rate, the percentage of nuclear supplied in this country is still the same, even though our usage has gone up. Well, the way we've done that is we've bumped up the power of these plants. 2, 3, 4, 5, 7%. So we're producing more electricity today than we were 30 years ago with the same plants, and they're 30, 40 years old.
And they're all-
We haven't built a new plant, and we haven't really started building another plant. It'll be at least another 7 to 8 years before the first new plant comes online. So we've been making do with what we've had for a long time, but that is not INPO's. It's not even on their radar screen. That's the NRC's
I just
requirement.
wonder, with INPO going in and doing the evaluations and assisting the older facilities, if there is, if there are any major changes coming up?
No, but I will tell you, when we do evaluations, or when they did, and I said we did, but when they do evaluations on those plants, they're very cognizant of the fact that in the original construction design, we had a safety margin, let's say this big. There was a lot of conservatism built into those plants. There was a lot of margin from where we operated to where, things would go wrong. Well, when you take the same plant and upgrade it, you're requiring more of it than it was originally designed to do. Guess what? that margin of safety gets real small. So many of these plants operate with a much smaller margin of safety than they did before, which means you gotta really be thinking smart about what you're doing, how you're running the plant, how are you gonna do your maintenance, what's the risks associated with that. So what INPO would do is look at not only the upgrades, the design aspects, the engineering, was it done properly? More importantly, how are you operating? How are you maintaining the plant? That gets into, are you investing in the plant? Are you ensuring that these old pumps are being upgraded? Those types of things. So INPO is looking at, are we maintaining high levels of excellence, but in terms of the actual extensions and those, that's the NRC's.
We've also benefited from shorter refueling outages, more online time, that capacity numbers improved.
Oh, yeah. Back in the 70s and 80s, our outages, 70, 80, 100-day outages, no questions asked, because all that cost, it cost us to be down, we just passed that on to the ratepayers. That went into your electric bill. You can't do that anymore. Now we do outages, refueling outages in 14 days. It's pretty cool. But we do a lot more maintenance online than we used to do, which puts the plant at more risk doing maintenance online. If I'm shut down, I don't need diesels. I can take the diesels apart. Online, I need them. I can still take them apart, but I got to get them back in 7 days. That's not always easily done. So there's a lot of risk with that. But we're doing much, much better. Capacity factor back in the late 70s, early 80s was probably 60%, which means plants ran producing electricity about 60% of the time, on average. Today, they're at 92, 93% routinely across the board. That's how we're still producing. That's one of the ways we've been producing, because we're producing 40% more electricity than we used to using the same plants because they run. A lot of these plants run breaker to breaker. They come out of refueling outage, they start up, run 100% power for 300 plus days. Shut down, do a refueling outage, start up and run another 300, 400 days. It's good stuff. Takes a lot to do that though. Takes a lot more to do. And then I mentioned new plants. We do startup review visits. They do startup review visits. We did them at Browns Ferry. They're doing them now at Watts Bar, Unit 2. If Bellefonte ever comes on, they'll do it at Bellefonte as well. That's basically new construction. They get involved with the, not just the startup review, but the construction for new construction. They'll be involved with that construction process from the beginning. Just making sure that they're following industry standards. Are they learning from their mistakes? Are they learning from others going forward? So that when they get down to the point of actually starting up, they'll be able to do that. Back in the early days of construction, we'd say we were ready to start up and find out we forgot to install a complete system and had to spend another 6 months running pipe. It wasn't fun. And I already talked about construction. So this is new to INPO within the last year. Fukushima, which will be there, but also these new plants. It's important that we get these things started and built. And that should help us move forward for new builds moving forward, like Summer in South Texas and a few of those other places. But we got to get at least the first one and prove to people we can do it on time, on schedule, no injuries, do it safe. If we can't do that, it's going to be hard pressed to convince people that it's worth investing $4, $5, $6, $8 billion in a plant. You can't build it right. Any questions? Oh, I mentioned this as well. INPO is involved with fuel manufacturing. They'll go to manufacturers, fuel manufacturers, make sure that the fuel is being manufactured, where the reactor vessels, steam generators, whatever is being built, they go out there again, holding those individuals. Most of those vendors are supplier participants. They're members of INPO. They fall under the same guidance that the plants do. They don't get review visits and assessed, but they open the doors. You're part of the club. You got to allow folks to come in and take a look at what you're doing and be critical of your work going forward. And they appreciate it. They appreciate it. Another program, so. I put a website up here. If anybody's interested, you won't get a lot of detailed information. You won't be able to look at the operating experience. This is a public website, www.info.info. They'll tell you a little bit about the history, they'll tell you what job opportunities are out there, those types of things, but that's about it.
I was on INPO's website today, there's a lot of really, it's cool to learn from maybe mistakes or operating experiences of others. But is there a similar resource just for best practices? Are there publications for best practices in order to achieve these INPO 1 levels without having to?
Not from INPO. There are a lot of best practice documents that INPO
So
publishes,
the guidelines.
but you have to be a member of INPO to get access to them.
So if you're a member of INPO, I've seen these called good practices. Is there
Well, that's what,
excellence?
no, well, that's what they are, best practices. In certain areas where people have demonstrated, very good practices of doing certain things, they document those and publish those. But there's not a guide that says, if you want an INPO 1, go do this. Well, there is. It's the performance objectives and criteria. If you want to be an INPO 1, do that and do it well. It's that easy. I mean, it's simple. Just do it. It's easier said than done. It's hard to get there. It's harder to stay there. It's very hard to stay there because the scale's always moving. Excellence this year isn't excellence next year. Somebody's going to outdo you, and if you're happy with being a 1 now, 2 years, 4 years from now, you'll be a 2, maybe a 3. And it has happened. We have clients who have been a 1, gone to a 4. Come back to a 1 because they learned their lesson. They didn't learn it the first time. Felt good being at the top. Yes.
When an event happens and it's already worked through and everything, do you publicize for the members a suggestion of how to prevent it from happening with their plans?
Yes, the event reports are sent out. Level 1s go to every utility and with recommendations of what to do. It may just be go out and review this and determine whether or not you're susceptible. But you have to go do it within a time frame and then send a report to INPO saying what you did and what you found. And if you think you are, what are you going to do about it? Significant events. Level 2s may have recommendations, but no corrective actions. The 3s and the 4s are just information sharing.
At the level 1, you,
Yeah. All of those,
that you do check the situation
yes,
out.
all of those event reports get sent to all INPO members. That's an automatic. Everybody's on distribution. They don't have to go looking for them. They get them. Every day they get this information coming through. Any other questions? INPO is, you guys leave here, go to work at a plant, you will experience the fun and joy of an INPO evaluation or accreditation review, because if you're at a plant in any of the functional areas, you are the recipients of training. So even there, you'll be asked, how was training here?
Thanks, Steve. I think we understand the scope a little better.
I think I know how to switch.
Good.
Appreciate it.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you very much. Oh, I put this book, if you've never read this book, I strongly suggest you read it. It was written in 1994 by this guy and it's really about it really says hostages of each other, transformation of the nuclear industry after 3 Mile Island. Talked a lot about the formation of INPO and what it was doing in 1994. They talked about regulators and all that. They're not a regulator. But it's an excellent book, and this concept of hostages of each other, and you can see from Fukushima and the others. We can't say, well, we're doing well, and the guy down the street, well, that's his problem. Well, it's all our problem. One plant has a significant event in this country, it will shut down the entire